Happy Thursday. You just finished taking your writing curriculum assessment, and I need you to finish this video before Friday morning so that you are ready to do tomorrow's work during our live session. All right, so the focus of today's lesson, Chapter 7, Lesson 6, is the properties of mathematics. Now, just like the order of operations, these are rules that we need to memorize, things that we need to understand about how math works. Now, hopefully you watched those music videos to kind of help you get an overall gist of the things that you need to understand. Commutative properties, we have mentioned a lot this year already, and I'm sure you heard it in 5th grade and 4th grade too. Commutative only works for multiplication and addition. And that basically is where you can change the order of the add-ins, 7 plus 9, 9 plus 7, and you get actually the same sum. And the same thing is true for multiplication. Multiplication is repeated addition. So you can say 4 groups of 6 or 6 groups of 4, and you're going to get the same product. Now, the associative property also only works for addition and subtraction. The important thing to remember about the associative property, it's not about moving and changing numbers around. It's about doing certain parts of the equation first. It's about grouping. So you're going to see parentheses. So you have 3 plus 9 plus 4, 3 plus 9 plus 4. They're in the same order, but you can leave that 3 there and add the 9 and 4 together and get 13, and then add 3 and get 16. Or you could add the 3 and 9 together first and get 12, and 12 plus 4 is 16. So you get the same add-in, but you are actually adding them in a different order. But the order of the actual add-ins do not change, just the parentheses move around. Same thing is true for multiplication. 8 times 5 times 7, 8 times 5 times 7. Those numbers didn't move around, but you could say, oh, 5 times 7 is 35, multiply that by 8. And then you could say 8 times 5 is 40, multiply that by 7, and you're going to end up getting the same product, which is 280. Okay? All right, so now, and you can see below here we have variables basically describing those same concepts. Identity property we've also talked about before. Anything that you add the number 0 to is going to be the same number. 13 plus 0 is 13. A plus 0 is A. Identity property for multiplication, though, involves multiplying by 1. So 7 times 1 is 7. A times 1 is A. And then you have the inverse properties, which we've also used this year as well. If you have a positive 6 plus a negative 6, you're going to get 0. Okay, and we talked about that as being 0 pairs. So the positive plus the negative of the same, that have the same absolute value, you're going to get the number 0. And then, of course, if you have 6, whole number 6 divided by the inverse, which is 1/6, you're going to end up getting the number 1. And so we've also worked with that this year as well. It says determine whether two expressions are equivalent. If so, tell what property is applied. If not, explain why. So if we have 15 plus 5 plus 8, 15 plus 5 plus 8, we just saw that up here when you don't change the order and the add-ins are in the same order but the parentheses move, that is definitely the associative property. So they actually solved it and found that both of them were actually equal to the sum of 28. So that is the associative property. So those two things are equivalent. But down here, that is not going to work. 20 minus 12 minus 3 and 20 minus 12 minus 3. The associative property does not work for subtraction. You can see if we subtract 12 from 20 and we get 8 and minus 3 is going to be 5. That's not the same thing as 12 minus 3 is 9, 20 minus 9 is 11. So that does not work for subtraction. So those two things are not equal. All right, so if we come up over here, all right, so we have two more examples. We're going to determine whether these two expressions are equivalent. Is 34 plus 0 and 34 equivalent? Of course they are. That's called the identity property. And then we have 20 divided by 5 and 5 divided by 20. These are not equivalent because this is commutative property. If it was... Sorry about that. Apparently my dog needed some attention, so I just scratched her on the head. All right. If this was multiplication, this would be the commutative property, but that doesn't work for division. If you have 20 pieces of candy divided by 5 people, that is not the same thing as 5 pieces of candy getting shared by 20 people. So those two things are not equivalent. This would be 4 and this would be 1/4. And so those two things are not the same. Okay, so let's do some practicing. All right, so we have to do 2 things for each problem, starting with the letter A. We have to figure out if these 2 expressions are equivalent, and then we have to figure out what property it represents if they are equivalent. So we have 5 times 6 times 3. And then we have 5 times 6 times 3. Okay, so this first one we do parentheses first. What is 6 times 3? Okay, if you said 18, you are correct. Now what I need you to do is evaluate or solve what 18 times 5 is. Go ahead and do that for me. Okay, if you said 90, you are correct. Now we're going to figure out what this other side is. Parentheses have us doing 5 times 6 first. Go ahead and tell me what that answer is. All right, if you said 30, you're correct. And then we're going to multiply it by 3, and of course we're going to get 90. Because 3 times 3 is 9 with the 0. So these are both equivalent. Now, what property is that? Go ahead and answer that for me. That is actually going to be the associative property. And the reason why it's the associative property is that it never moved any of the numbers around. Associative. I hope I spelled that right. Okay, so it's associative property because all it did was move the parentheses. 5, 6, 3. 5, 6, 3. Also, it's multiplication. So only multiplication and addition can use the associative property. All right, we're going to try one more. Let's do, well, we're going to do more than one more. Let's do B. If we have 27 divided by 3, is that the same thing as 3 divided by 27? Go ahead and solve that and then tell me whether yes or no they are the same. Okay, the answer is no, because 27 divided by 3 is 9, and 3 divided by 27 is 1/9. Those are not the same thing. All right, so let's go ahead and look at 18 plus 13 minus 13 and the number 18. Are those two things equivalent? Let's check that out. Okay, first off, we know that we can actually write subtraction problems as addition problems. We can actually add a negative, change the subtraction problem into a negative. So this would be 18 plus 13 minus 13. Now, once I've done that, what could we do to make this a simpler problem? So once we make this into addition, we can use the property of what to find the answer. Go ahead and answer that question for me. So changing that subtraction problem to addition problem opens up quite a few things for us. One thing is the associative property. So what I can do, since this is all addition now, we're adding a negative, I can actually group this together. Once I group a positive 13 and a negative 13 together, that is going to be the inverse property, and that is going to equal 0. So that only leaves us with 18. So the answer is you can use the inverse property and the associative property. Okay, so we're going to do one last practice problem, and that is 2 times 6 times 1/6. Is that equivalent to the number 2? So I want you to think about the properties that we can use in order to solve this one on the left a little more efficiently. I notice there's a 6, and I notice there's a 6 down here. Go back and look at the properties and see what might help you. So once you do that, tell me whether yes, these are equivalent, or no, they're not equivalent. Go ahead and work that out for me, please. Okay, the answer is yes, they are equivalent, and this is why. Because this is all multiplication, I can use the associative property, and I can put parentheses around and do this first. And if I have a whole number 6 and a 1/6, using the inverse property, that becomes the number 1. And 1 times 2 is, of course, 2, and 2 is equivalent to 2. So the answer is yes, because we can use associative property and the inverse property, just like the one we just did, except for this one was using multiplication. All right, so what I want you guys to think about now is, what's the most important thing that we learned from this lesson today? Go ahead and answer that for me.